For decades, European halls of power painted the Americas as an abundant, sunlit paradise ready to be plucked. Those who actually made the months-long Atlantic crossing found something else entirely. As their ships approached the continent, they were greeted by an impenetrable wall of dense, freezing, and isolated wilderness. Survival demanded immediate, grueling physical exertion. Before anyone could search for gold or claim territory, they had to clear ancient, thick forests by hand. In places like Jamestown, colonists spent their first precious weeks exhausting themselves to fell trees and construct heavy timber palisades, desperate for a barrier against the unknown. Their European farming techniques failed in the swampy, unfamiliar coastal soil. Crops withered. Worse, the marshy terrain bred mosquitoes, and within months, diseases like dysentery and malaria tore through the camps. The death toll was staggering. This 16th century map of the Virginia coastline shows what expeditions were up against. Navigating this labyrinth of inlets and barrier islands was treacherous. Settlements like Roanoke and Croatoan were dangerously isolated, cut off, and highly vulnerable to the elements. The grand colonial dreams of easy wealth quickly dissolved. The immediate, terrifying necessity of finding fresh water, building shelter, and surviving the next fever replaced idealism with a desperate daily fight against nature itself. Without regular resupply fleets from Europe, winter turned the North American coast into a frozen trap. Colonists had to rely entirely on whatever manual skills they brought with them to mend clothes, hunt unfamiliar game, and ration dwindling grain supplies. They rarely had enough. Poor planning, bad soil, and the physical exhaustion of settlers resulted in catastrophically low harvests. When the first deep freezes hit, the settlements descended into mass starvation. We can see the grim reality on this population chart. During the winter months, the colonists' survival rate experiences a steep drop. Living through the freeze was mathematically impossible for these early arrivals. The only reason the line reversed and trended back up was direct intervention and aid from local tribes. First contact involved a tense exchange of gifts and critical survival information. Native leaders shared local game, provided maize, and taught the settlers how to cultivate. Look at these specific moments of contact overlaying our chart. Each point of trade directly stabilizes the colonial death rate. This early cooperation was born entirely out of settler desperation. They needed the tribes to avoid starvation. But because the relationship relied on acute necessity rather than genuine diplomacy, the alliance was structurally flawed. As soon as the colonies learned to feed themselves and stockpile their own food, the dynamic would violently shift. Once the colonies stabilized and starvation was no longer an annual guarantee, the mission shifted. The settlers moved from scratching out a basic survival to building an aggressive, expanding agricultural economy. They locked into what economists call the triangle trade. European manufactured goods sailed to Africa, enslaved humans were transported to the Americas, and raw, lucrative commodities like sugar, tobacco, and rum were shipped back to Europe. To understand the industrial scale of this system, look at this stowage plan from the British slave ship Brooks. European demand for cash crops required massive, cheap labor, driving an explosion in the slave trade. People were reduced to precise cargo units to maximize profit. This animated map tracks the results on the ground. A global export economy is infinitely hungry for acreage. To grow more tobacco and cotton, the colonies needed more soil. You can watch the borders push outward year by year, deliberately consuming established Native American territories. The local survival economy had vanished. In its place stood a highly profitable, exploitative machine that required constant territorial expansion. By its very design, this economic engine guaranteed violent, large-scale conflict with native populations. The breaking point in New England arrived with King Philip's War. Tensions flared over colonists' livestock destroying native crops, and the aggressive push by European missionaries to convert natives and build towns squarely on Wampanoag land. The ensuing conflict was the bloodiest to date on the continent. The New England militias decimated the Wampanoag and their allies. It permanently ruptured any remaining native settler alliances in the region, replacing cautious diplomacy with total war. The pressure compounded as European imperial conflicts, like King William's War and Queen Anne's War, spilled across the Atlantic. Settlers and native tribes fought proxy wars ordered by kings thousands of miles away, turning daily colonial life into a constant state of siege. This global friction peaked with the 7 Years' War. The conflict engulfed the North American frontier, forcing the remaining native tribes into a devastating dilemma. They had to pick a side between the heavily armed English and French forces, hoping to leverage the winner for their own survival. This 1750 map illustrates the geopolitical stakes. Notice the massive, overlapping claims of the English, French, and Spanish empires pressing against one another. By 1763, the borders were redrawn. The French were expelled from their North American holdings, leaving Great Britain the undisputed dominant power. A century of constant warfare left a deep mark on the colonists. They were no longer scattered, vulnerable farmers. They had transformed into a highly militarized society, sitting on a geopolitical flashpoint, armed and ready to defend their borders. Surviving this era required an immense psychological toll. Generations of colonists had endured mass disease, brutal physical labor, and decades of relentless frontier warfare. They needed a way to process the compounding hardships of daily life. They found it in a massive religious revival known as the Great Awakening. This evangelical Protestant movement swept through the colonies, providing a spiritual framework that allowed these traumatized populations to find collective purpose in their survival. The movement was driven by traveling preachers like George Whitefield, who delivered passionate, open-air sermons. Look at this historical broadside. Whitefield's events drew crowds of up to 30,000 people at a time. He bypassed traditional churches and spoke directly to the masses, drawing people from every class and background. Because these revivals crossed colonial lines, they created something entirely new. For the first time, a farmer in Massachusetts and a blacksmith in Virginia shared a common cultural experience that existed entirely outside the direction of their local colonial governments or the distant British Crown. By the 1760s, the colonists had survived a century of isolation and 4 global wars, largely by relying on their own local militias and spiritual networks. The Great Awakening proved they could organize a massive social movement without royal oversight. They were no longer a collection of separate outposts. They had become a self-reliant population that had learned to operate entirely on its own terms.